Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at the James Julia Auction House up in Maine, taking a look at some of the guns that they're going to be selling in their upcoming fall of 2017 firearms auction. And we've got a magnificent silver-plated Civil War era revolver here today. Specifically, this is a Shawk McLanahan revolver, which you may have never heard of because, well, virtually nobody's ever heard of these. They were actually, interestingly, misidentified as Confederate revolvers for quite a while before some researchers were able to determine the true complete story to where these things actually came from. Now, the story was difficult to get because it's estimated that they only made 45 to 50 of them in the first place, and only 8 are known to exist, and this is one of those 8. To complicate things, while this actually had no connection to the Confederacy, or at least Shawk McLanahan didn't, this gun was actually given as a presentation to a Confederate brigadier general by some of his troops late in the Civil War. So they bought it and thought it was a really nice revolver and gave it to the general, but the gun wasn't actually made for the Confederacy. This was manufactured in a town called Carondelet, Missouri, which is now a suburb of St. Louis. At the time it was on the outskirts or just outside St. Louis. And it was the product of 3 different guys. The first was Abel Shawk, S-H-A-W-K. And he was sort of an engineering, manufacturing, entrepreneurial sort of guy. The business that brought him to St. Louis in 1853 was actually manufacturing fire engines. And he did that for a while and then decided to set up a shop making firearms. To do that, he enlisted the help of J.K. McLanahan, who we know very little about. McLanahan appears to have just been a financier. And then the third guy involved was a German immigrant by the name of William. Well, his name was Wilhelm, and he anglicized it here in the United States to William Tegethoff. And Tegethoff appears to have been either he was a gunsmith when he arrived or he picked up the trade pretty quickly. And what's interesting is the first 2 known examples of these revolvers are actually marked William Tegethoff, and this is one of them. This is actually serial number 1. Serial number 2 also survives, and it's a Tegethoff gun. All the rest are either completely unmarked or they're marked Shawk McLanahan. So the circumstances surrounding this is basically St. Louis was kind of the last major point of civilization on the trail westward into the United States. So it was a good place to be marketing supplies and, say, firearms. There were a lot of gunsmiths that were set up in St. Louis, and Shawk apparently thought that this would be a decent place to make a nice percussion revolver. The patents that Colt had on revolver mechanisms were expiring, and so the market was kind of opening up to entrepreneurs who wanted to make their own, basically mechanical copies of the Colt mechanism. And what Shawk made here, or Shawk and McLanahan and Tegethoff, is actually a really good quality revolver. But something happened that caused a problem. We know in 1861 there was a court case between Shawk and McLanahan, and that's never a good sign for a business partnership. Apparently McLanahan ended up winning money from Shawk. By this point, as far as I can tell, all of the guns had already been manufactured. What they were going to make, they already had. Of the 8 surviving examples, none of them are actually alike, or none of them are identical. They never got to the point of having standard mass production guns. So it's easy to speculate how such a venture might have fallen apart. All sorts of supply issues or just financing issues, anything. What's interesting though is it wasn't the quality of the guns. The guns appear to be actually quite nice. In fact, this one was nice enough that it was dolled up, silver plated, and given this nice metal, really fancy engraved holster to a general level officer. So it wasn't a problem with the guns. The other interesting twist to this story relates to how these were originally confused with being Confederate guns, and that is when Shawk came to St. Louis, one of the guys that he met up with and actually became friends with was a guy named Charles Rigdon. Well, Rigdon would go on to make firearms for the Confederacy under the names, Rigdon and Ansley, Leach and Rigdon. There were a couple of ventures that he was involved in. And there was a lot of speculation that he had something to do with this revolver, or because Shawk was associated with him, Shawk had been a Confederate sympathizer as well. That actually appears to really not be the case. The tooling for these existed first. It might have been, the purchase of the original tooling might have been brokered through Rigdon, who ran a machine shop in St. Louis at the time. And it sounds like when Shawk and McLanahan, when their venture fell apart, the machine tools were actually sold back to Rigdon, and they may well have been the same machine tools that were used to make Rigdon's Confederate revolvers. Now, it wasn't the same tooling, and there's an important difference there. What was probably sold were just machines, lathes, grinders, that sort of thing, and a rifling machine. One of the specific things we know about Shawk is he designed a rifling machine. In fact, if you look at his guns, number 1 and 2, the ones that are marked Tegethoff, have 4 lands and grooves in the rifling, probably made from barrels purchased elsewhere. The ones that are marked Shawk and McLanahan have 7 land and groove rifling, which are probably made on the machine designed by Shawk. And he probably sold that machine to Charles Rigdon when the business fell apart. What he did not do was sell tooling to actually manufacture this specific gun, the jigs and the fixtures and the things that you would use on the machines to make parts. And that we know that because this gun is mechanically completely different from the Rigdon and Annesley guns or the Leech and Rigdon guns. Those had, for example, a 3-part frame. This has a 1-piece frame of a substantially different shape. So if Rigdon got the tooling for these, he didn't actually use it. Being one of the very first of these guns, this is one of the Tegethoff marked ones. And that marking is here on the cylinder and also on top of the barrel, and it's really small. That is as close as I can get the camera to focus in on it, but you can see WM Tegethoff and repeated right up here on the barrel. Now the barrel one is kind of under some other marring, so it's a little bit harder to read. Shawk and McLanahan's revolver here is uses a brass frame, although this particular one was silver plated for presentation. And even though the finish is wearing, this is a 150-plus-year-old gun, you can kind of tell that this was a high-quality gun to begin with. You really don't see the imperfections and the machine marks and just the general kind of shoddy workmanship that is often present on Confederate, specifically Confederate production revolvers. This was a really nice gun, and in many ways, maybe it's too bad that their business venture wasn't able to do better, because it seems like they had a nice product. If you look at the frame, this is all a single piece. Typically on a Colt or a Colt copy, the rear tang here is a separate piece, and then the front, with a part that the barrel attaches into, is also usually a separate piece. On a Colt, the whole barrel assembly was removable. You can't do that on a Shawk and McLanahan because, well, the frame is all one piece, and that makes for a nice strong revolver. It's interesting to note that the loading lever is retained by a spring-loaded detent, which is in really good shape today, really kind of remarkable for as old as the gun is. And then it has a nice smooth lever linkage there. And just overall, really nice lines, at least to me. Of all of the Civil War era revolvers, if I wasn't going to get a Colt, this would be a pretty darn good one as a customer in the 1850s. Clearly, I'm not the only one who was thinking that way, because in 1865, the members of the South Carolina Reserve Force saw fit to commission this very fancy engraved metal holster for that exact Shawk and McLanahan pistol, and present it to Brigadier General James Chestnut. Here we can see the engraving on the back. We got some Latin up there, and then from fellow officers of the South Carolina Reserve Force, January 3rd, 1865, to a fine man and officer, Brigadier General James Chestnut, Confederate States. Someone really put quite a lot of work into this holster. And with that amount of work, it's in some ways surprising that they didn't use a Colt revolver, although they may not have had access to one easily at the time. That's going to fit right in there. Usually, if we're looking at Civil War era revolvers where they only made a couple dozen, it's legitimately usually a Confederate gun, because that's usually all the Confederate manufacturers were able to put out. In this case, this is actually a Civil War era gun that doesn't have any direct connection to either side in the war, because these were manufactured in between 1858 and late 59 or early 1860. So they really weren't actually made for the war. There's an interesting story to this one about the holster. The holster is being sold separately. Now we know these two go together because, well, they were documented out of the war that way. And what actually happened was the owner of the pair had the gun stolen. And the thief didn't get the holster but took the gun. So the owner got an insurance payout for it. And then later the gun surfaced when the thief tried to steal it. It was confiscated. I don't know exactly what happened to the thief, but presumably he was convicted. The gun actually then became the property of the insurance company, and the insurance company decided to sell it here at James Julia. Well, the guys at Julia happened to know who had owned it before. That guy still had the holster, and so the original owner is consigning the holster to sell it, and they're of course hoping that one person buys both and puts them back together. But because they are currently owned by two different entities, this belonging to the guy and this belonging to an insurance company, they can't sell them as a single lot. Anyway, if you're interested in these, take a look at the description text below. There's a link there to the two catalog pages, one for the gun and one for the holster. And you can see their pictures and provenance. There's a bunch of documentation, a really good article on these guns that you can see through the catalog. Anyway, and if you're interested, you can place a bid on one or both, hopefully both, through the website, over the phone, or live here in person at the auction. Thanks for watching.